Right.
It was all good till then. It was all perfect, and then it was like, okay.
In country-sized chunks of data or information. We just want to look at a little piece of the Earth's surface.
That doesn't really make sense. Could we just write it so that it does make sense?
Then I'm like, I should have studied law.
The legal terms that are in there have been written by dinosaurs in the ancient times.
Great. If you zoom in, it's not so great. You can't get a lot of detail.
I'm just blown.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Season 2, Episode 6 of Space Smurfs, a podcast where we mostly discuss about space stuff, but we also end up rambling about other topics from K-pop to NFTs. And this is your host, Alina Joseph, the potentially spaced out space person. And today, along with me, we have our Iron Lady of APOSA, Dr. Sindhu, who joined us during the last episode as well, explaining about Cosmic Sandbox workshop and things like that. And this episode also, she's co-hosting with me. So, Sindhu, again, can you please tell us about the Cosmic Sandbox workshop? And I think the audience will be more curious to learn more about this year's topic as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Smurfs, for having me as co-host for this episode as well. I'm so excited for this podcast as well. And before we jump into the amazing experts and interesting profile that they have here, let me just briefly explain what this workshop is all about, right? So Cosmic Sandbox is a flagship event conducted by APOSA, which is Asia Pacific Oceania Space Association. This is a multidisciplinary design thinking workshop where we bring together a community of problem solvers. If you are a problem solver and you want to know more about the space industry from multiple different perspectives, please do look out for the registration links and sign up for the workshop. And all the amazing experts as well will be joining us on the day of the workshop. And the whole point of the workshop is to create an awareness among the community that it takes multiple disciplines to actually do something. And it is very much important when it comes to space industry, right? And it's just one day event, 4 hours of your time. And you can also interact with these experts here. And the topic is about space for environment, Earth intelligence to be precise. And we'll also be talking about technology, law, policy, social impact that it is creating, and the climate change perspectives. And when it comes to climate, it's a very challenging domain in the Asia Pacific region. Yeah.
And as you might have heard from Sindhu herself, this year we are coming with the topic Earth observation for Earth intelligence. And it's a really interesting topic, like you might not even know what exactly is Earth intelligence. So through this workshop, you will know more about it. And it's really interesting to look into the nuances of how space and space assets can actually contribute to Earth intelligence. And with this workshop, you will also get a chance to directly interact with the experts that we are bringing up to you. And it's a really great opportunity. So I will actually encourage all of our audience to click down on the description box and see the registrations link. And it's a free event. Please do join us. And also follow us on our social media handles to know more about this workshop and how we are going to do it. Yeah. And through this collaboration with Cosmic Sandbox and Space Smurfs, we are also bringing experts from different perspectives to you to talk about. And for today, we have two experts here, Christine Lachlan, Arrowsmith, and Donna Lawler. And Sindhu, I think she is much better to explain and invite them into the stage today. Yeah, Sindhu, go ahead.
Thank you, Alina. So Donna here is currently a principal at Azimuth Advisory, who are space law specialists. And she's also a legal advisor to governments and businesses involved in space activities with 20 years of experience in the space industry, including 6 satellite build and launch programs for geostationary satellites. She's also part of the advisory board of Space Missions Company and Space Industries. And Christine here is the principal engineer at Streamology Waterway Science and Management. Streamology is a bustling niche consulting firm with a goal of making a difference in the way we strategically manage water and waterways in both urban and rural settings. We will know more about both of them and what they do in this podcast. Welcome.
Yes, welcome Donna and Christian to our podcast, and thank you for joining us as our expert. Over to you both.
Thank you very much for having us involved in the project. It's great to be here and be able to have a chat to you and talk about some of the interesting things that we use space data for, from my perspective. And I'll be interested to hear from Donna on the legal side of things, because for me, open data is really important, and being able to get access to it is probably a critical way that we can move forward in some of the ways that we actually use the information. So I'm keen to hear from Donna, and I hope that some of the information or some of the understanding that I've gleaned over the years on how to use some of this information and how it sort of complements other types of data that we also collect could be of interest to your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, between us, we probably know quite a lot, but there's a lot of things I don't know, Christine. So we should probably share a bit of information. But I'm looking forward to chatting with all of the problem solvers out there, because that's what I like doing. I like working with people who are solving problems, and I like to be part of that process too.
Yeah, so without further ado, let the smurfing begin. So I'll move on to my very first question, actually, and that is to Christine here. So what does Twimology, your company, do? Like, I would like to know more about what exactly your services are. And also, I think the audience would also like to know, like, what exactly does Twimology do? Can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Sindhu said, we're sort of a niche company in the environmental and water related spaces. So essentially we are trying to improve how water is managed in the across the whole spectrum. So from our rivers, catchments, through to estuaries and the ocean. And so what we are trying to do is help improve our understanding of these systems and how they change and adapt over time, and what the forces and drivers are around those aspects, and how into the future what we might expect from them. So this helps inform decisions about where you might do activities in the catchment, new developments for towns and things like that. Where are you going to put housing and all that type of thing, down to with climate change, how our estuaries and our coastal systems going to adapt. What do we need to do to understand and make people safe in the future? But also, what about our biodiversity and the environment? What are the needs of those values that we have, and how can we manage them together with our own requirements in that space?
That's really amazing to hear about all these activities that they have been doing. Yeah.
So when you were explaining the application, I'm just curious, the listeners might as well be. So you mentioned about waterway management, right? So what is exactly this field of application, and what is the need and where it is heading in the next few years? So can you please
Yeah, absolutely. So waterway management encompasses a range of things. Probably a good example is the recent floods that we've had in the on the east coast of New South Wales and Queensland. And what you can see, there were pictures put up on social media of satellite images showing the extent of flooding and where the water was going and how it was changing day to day. So that sort of information helps us understand, well, what happens when these big sort of events take place. We use it to inform models, to then, do scenarios and test change, and what if we do something, what will the effect be? We also use information for management to monitor. So a key thing that we're involved in is monitoring of environmental water. So this is, in Australia, we have a lot of river systems that are heavily managed. So the water has a whole lot of different people and environments that need it. And so we have to make sure that we provide the water to those that need it, and also make sure the environment is healthy. And so they have something which we call environmental water. And what we're trying to do is optimize how we make sure that the right places get that water at the right time of year, and when they, it might be for habitat creation, it might be to prompt spawning of fish, all sorts of things. So we need to monitor both the delivery of the water, but also the response of the environment. So what did it actually achieve an outcome? Did we get the growth of the vegetation we want that then supports the birds, that supports all the other animals that might need to use that space? So yeah, looking at change over time is really important part of that management process for the environment.
Wow,
That's
that is, yeah, I'm just blown. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of like, you know, like looking at how we can bring in this service and also how to manage it properly. There were a lot of things happening, and I didn't think it was this. I mean, it is not complicated, but it was more elaborate, I will say. Yeah, it's more extensive. Yeah, that's the perfect term for it, I will say. Yeah. And let's move on to Donna here. And Donna, she is coming from the law and policy perspective of space. And I know about Azimuth Advisory, but I think the audience would like to know about what exactly is this and how things work there. So please, Donna, give us an introduction about Azimuth Advisory.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, Azimuth Advisory is a law firm. So the boring part of my job is I read a lot of very boring documents, so just like any other lawyer. But the cool part about my job is that I'm a space lawyer. So all of the boring documents are about interesting space programs. So our clients are governments and universities and private companies that are involved in large, very, very large and small space programs. So constellations of small satellites, launch vehicles, launch facilities, and some of this involves building spacecraft that will be used for space observation. Earth observation, also space observation, actually, and remote sensing. And then right down to companies that are aggregating that data for use in other areas, and then for use for customers. And then also some of our clients are users of data as well. So people who are using data and trying to get access to data. So there's a whole very exciting range of things happening, which has all been spawned over the last 3 or 4 years as new space starts to get momentum all over the Asia Pacific and elsewhere. And that's been the fun journey that we've been on for the last few years.
Yeah, I totally resonate with what she just mentioned about like everything just started to boom in like the last, maybe we can just give a decade, maybe like within the last decade, it just sprung up like everything, like most of the countries are entering into the space domain. You see a lot of countries getting into, like, the priorities might be different though. Like sometimes they just want to bring in space economy or have the technological advancements. So sometimes use the space-based assets for climate change issues and things like that. But the thing is, more people, more actors are coming into it, not just state actors, but private actors as well as institutions, things like that. So I definitely agree to what she mentioned about it's a cool job actually, being a space lawyer. And I don't know, I'm not coming from the law background, but from the policy background, I do admire all the space lawyers out there. I'm like, I should have studied law one day. But yeah,
never too late.
Yeah, it's never too late. But if I'll have to do it on my own. Maybe not. I mean, if I tell my family again, they will be like, no, you won't go get a job. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I'll mention is that we have two parts of our firm, and I tend to do the grubby commercial stuff. And my husband, who is an international space lawyer, represents Australia. We're based in Australia, but he represents Australia at the UN. We've just come back from Vienna, where I was an observer, but he was chairing meetings about uses of space resources.
Wow.
So we've just spent 2 weeks sitting in Vienna listening to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, where he was chairing some of the meetings. There is a lot of very interesting international law, national law, and commercial law aspects of space.
Exactly.
Very true. Yeah. I'm not from law and policy background, so whenever I hear about these things, this is like only for the past 1 year when I started working with Alina, and there is one more space lawyer in our team. So that's when I actually realized that the multiple disciplines are so amazing. So I come from a technology background. So this unawareness in me is what driven actually to this workshop as well. It's amazing to hear you guys talk about, okay, there is national and international. So there is two different layers, right? And there is also commercial things that come into picture, which is both national and international. So yeah, all of these nice things we will get in soon. Before that, I hear this word data often, right? So I wanted to ask Christine on how exactly these data are used and what are the different kinds of data that you actually use in your work to do this analysis.
Yeah. So it covers a wide range of what you term data. So there's climate data is really important. So having information about the weather to help drive some of the models that we use. But the main one that we're looking at is predominantly sort of imagery. So having high resolution imagery in a whole range of colour spectrums to help us understand what's happening on the surface. And so you look at things like reflectance. So what's the reflectance of the surface to different wavelengths of light and things like that. So we're really trying to tease out what's changing. So we look at, say, if you're looking at vegetation, you look at all the different colours in the spectrum up to infrared, near infrared, and the normal RGB colour range. So those are all the types of wavelength that we look at, and then they'll each tell us something about what's happening to that vegetation on the ground surface, or whether there's actually any vegetation there, or whether it's water, all that sort of thing. So the data tells us what's actually on the surface, and then we interpret that to make an understanding of what the processes that are occurring are. Other bits of data that we do use at times are a great data set coming in is the satellite altimeter data. So that's measuring the height of the ocean surface. And so that's becoming increasingly important as a source of information about sea level rise and also wave heights and things like that. So that's just a simple measurement that's, at a point on the surface, how is that changing over time, and you track it. And so that just having that consistent measurement over a long period of time is a key bit of information that we can use to help our understanding.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, go on.
No, I was thinking like it's more like when you use space-based technologies for climate change, issues like climate change or monitoring environment and things like that, it's mostly the Earth observation satellites being used, and then comes in the data policy and things like that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So connecting from there, like I know, Donna, you have been working with the commercial aspects of space law, but still there might have been certain situations where you might have interacted with data policy when it comes to your space law activities. So can you please explain on such experiences that you might have in your experience in your career?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I do work in the, not just in Australia, but in the Asia Pacific region generally. And so a lot of our clients are using data in one way or another. I tend to be called in when there is no open data. If there's open data, people can, they don't need me, they can just go get it, and as long as you can fill in the forms and so on. But where there is an open data, I am often called in to help negotiate the commercial terms with private operators. And so my experience is really coming from the negative side of the coin in a way, which is what happens when there is no data and how hard is it to get your hands on it? And the answer is very hard, I think. Particularly, working with a wonderful company called Lawler, which is aggregating data and wants to sell it and make it easy for people who want to use data. They're creating a platform to do that. But to do the back end of their job, they have to reach agreements with all the different commercial data providers. And what we've found is, not just for them, but for everybody, it's the licensing terms given by the private operators are not really matched to the customer's needs. They tend to be and I'm going to be really rude here, but a lot of the legal terms that are in there have been written by dinosaurs in the ancient times. And I can see you nodding, Christine. You might have read some of these. They're long, they're impenetrable. They're not, they're charging per ginormous slab of area where people, 200 kilometres where you might only want to look at 2 kilometres. You've got to pay for 200. So the business models and the legal terms are not that useful. With that said, just touching briefly though on where there is open data, I'm not the expert on where it is and where it isn't, but I have observed that there have been interesting fluctuations in the countries that have, it's only really very sophisticated countries that have extensive space data. So, you're talking United States, Europe, India is one of them, Japan is one of them, Russia. There have been fluctuating policies within those big data-rich countries about what they share and how much they charge, if anything, for sharing it. And so, for example, a big source of data is the United States Landsat satellites, and they were free for a while, and then they had this ill-fated attempt to commercialize it, so they tried to charge for it in the 1980s, and then guess what? No one wanted it because it was too expensive. So they, and even their own internal agriculture departments weren't using Landsat data because they couldn't afford it. So they decided, oh, well, that didn't work. So they flipped it around and decided to make it free. So everyone's using it again. So you can get, wherever you're from, you can get free data from NASA and the European Space Agency, and India is very well advanced. I think they've had a remote sensing satellite since 1998, and there are certain parts of that data that are made available. The same with the Japanese, JAXA, and there are probably others, Christine, that you know about more than I. But beyond that, you're looking at, you thrust into the private commercial market, and that's where we can only hope that things evolve and it gets easy to buy stuff. So our Lawler, for example, are trying to make it easier. So, going through their platform might be a good start. But I would also like to throw this challenge out to any of the big data observation private companies that are listening to this, and that is you need to make it easier for your customers because you're causing enormous pain.
I really think the comment you made about the scale at which they offer it to people, like, we're not interested in country size chunks of data or information. We just want to look at a little piece of the Earth's surface, and charging us thousands of dollars for that privilege means that we just won't use it. We'll find some other way of doing it. So but those open data sources that you've talked about, so the Landsat and the Sentinel, they're that's where you go to start with. And if you can't solve your problem with those data sources, then you start looking around. Probably with the more commercial operators coming in, it's just knowing what they're collecting. Like, where do you find out who's collecting what and what level of accuracy? And no idea. Haven't really delved into that to date because too hard to find that.
Well, I will a little shout out for our client, our Lawler, because they are trying to do that, and they're putting together a library that you can search. And also, there are some, depending on the scale that you want, but the ability to task a satellite to go and capture something specific, and it's something that we've looked at also, which is how do you go about satellite tasking? What order are things done in? Who gets priority? Who owns what results? What the results? What are the license terms for the outputs? It all gets very complicated, but how automated is it? What happens if it doesn't succeed? Do you still have to pay? In some cases, maybe
I think that's a given when it comes to space-based technologies and anything, like even with launching a rocket or anything and using the service. things are expensive when it comes to space, right? Like you won't get things very easily. And when it comes to the law, I think making the law is one thing, and then implementing the law is another thing. Like implementing it properly so that people, like even if the companies come up with something where we can use the data can be used by everyone, or if there is a law that actually makes it possible, the proper implementation is something I think everyone needs to focus on, like whether everyone is getting it properly, whether the end user who is needy of such kind of a data is using it properly. That is something I think from my perspective that we all have to look into as well, like if that kind of a scenario happens. But yeah.
And that's exactly why this sandbox box is such a great idea, because if everybody's in their silos, like I'm an engineer and I do engineering, and I'm a lawyer and I just write boring documents, I do policy and I'm just going to write policies. Until you get everybody together, it actually doesn't work.
Exactly.
So you can have the best satellites in the world, but unless that data is making it to Christine, and unless Christine is getting the insights and giving them to users or the policy people so that they can change, get outcomes, then it doesn't work. So great work, guys, for setting up the whole concept.
Yeah, meanwhile, join us, guys. Yeah, I was just going to say a little promotion for our Cosmic Sandbox as well. Please do register for the Cosmic Sandbox workshop done by APOSA. Only limited seats are available right now, so please do register at the earliest so that you can also join this amazing design thinking workshop and become a problem solver. Yeah.
So I was listening to the conversation. As I said, I'm from technology background and I have I had zero clue on all of these topics, right? So one of the things that made very clear is, of course, the price, right? The price of the data, and that being a challenge. And second thing is figuring out like where exactly the data that I need to work on lies, and whether do I have an access to this data. So accessibility is another challenge. And I think it both goes together. So what are the other challenges, Donna, have you observed from the law? Even just you mentioned, right? Like laws are written in dinosaur ages. So it could be from law, it could be from your commercial experience, it could be from policy. What are the challenges that you have observed so far?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's start with the international and work our way down. Looking from the legal side, you've probably had other speakers in this program talk about the Magna Carta of space law, which is the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, which don't tell anyone, but I was born in that year, and so I have a special affinity with that. And space, the use and exploration of space under that treaty is the province of all humankind. So it's all about, and use of space should be for the benefit of all humankind. They say mankind, but let's grow up and call it humankind now. So there are a number of other treaties associated that have come along, and then there are various principles and guidelines that have come out that are non-binding but still persuasive. And one of the lot of principles are called the remote sensing guidelines. Or remote sensing principles, and they were from 1986. And so there is a principle that primary data and processed data and analyzed data should be open and should be made available on a non-discriminatory basis. But here's the kicker: subject to a reasonable cost.
Right. It was all good till then. It was all perfect, and then it was like, okay.
But it's like one of those disclaimers at the bottom of any insurance or things like that. Okay, that catches.
That's a good start, though, right? It's better than nothing. It's better than, But of course, look, space data it's highly political. Some of it everybody agrees. Look, let's share it. It's great. Let's help humanity. There is a thing called the Disasters Charter, which means if somebody's suffering a flood or a cyclone or a fire, then you should be able to, a state that is suffering that can activate the Disasters Charter, and there are members of the Disasters Charter that will provide free data, and that that is where you will there will be tasking of satellites, for example, that start honing in on the fires in Australia or the floods. They're always in Australia. The floods in Australia, or you know, the earthquake in India or somewhere else. So that's an important thing. One of the challenges is, and I've had a chat with the former head of UNUSA, Simonetta Di Pippo, about what are the challenges of making that work, the Disasters Charter. And she said that in practice, it's actually very difficult to, it takes a lot longer than they would like. So bureaucracy is one of the challenges. So, you know, to the discussion we just had, you can have the best data, you can have even the best laws, you can have willing people, you can have lots of goodwill and everywhere, but sometimes it's too many layers of bureaucracy and forms to fill out and approvals and blah, 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 blah. And it can take, you know, weeks and weeks instead of hours. You know, sometimes you need it within hours. So, you know, we've had some talks about how that might be improved. And the Disasters Charter itself needs updating and expanding. And then when you know, to deal with things like climate change, because that's not currently regarded as a disaster, but obviously it is. It is. And maybe to look upwards at space debris and things like that. Meteors that are coming.
I was going to say a good example was the eruption at Tonga and the blast wave that came off from that, and how it was tracked on the satellites by all sorts of people all around the world immediately, because you could see it in the data that, and then having to wait for the next pass to be able to see what's happening next. And, you know, that's super critical information to both save lives and to understand what's going on. And that happens all the time for different places around the world.
Exactly. And, you know, one of the key problems there was, you know, maybe the Disasters Charter shouldn't just be about observation, because one of the huge problems with in Tonga was that they had no communication, so you couldn't talk to any of these little villages. You couldn't talk to the whole of Tonga.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have actually a thing to add. So this is very true in terms of what we have been looking as information as part of Sandbox. So when we were going through the last workshop, it was about disaster management and risk management, community resilience building. So even the experts who turned out in that topic as well brought the same inference about how these frameworks are really good. Like, of course, better than not to have anything in place, but it still needs a lot of improvisation and, you know, adhering to the need of the hour, because when it comes to destruction and disasters, it's like my first few hours are critical. And within the few hours, you wouldn't expect to fill out a form or give a request, get data clearance from some company, or even whoever is part of this charter board or whatever that entity is. So just wanted to add that.
Absolutely.
It comes back to when you've got the access and the data, who's looking at it and do they understand it? Because if you don't have the resources or the skills within the country that's having the problem, who's going to help them? Who's going to provide the insights and understanding so they can use that information that's been collected to inform their decisions on the ground and rescue people or do what it is they need to do? There's some very skilled people, but they might not be in the location or, you know, be made aware that they could inform some of that decision making. So like for emergency management in a say a flood or a fire or something like that, you set up little groups internally that do that sort of work for them. You know, maybe there's more of a global perspective if you're considering space data and how you do it with disaster management as well.
Absolutely. Analysis of space data should be part of the Disasters Charter, really, and actually it might already be. But something you might want to look at, because probably be part of the solution there as well, in terms of, you know, especially when you're analysing floods and things like that. It's you know, there might be a flood in another part of the world and they get a bunch of you know, data from Maxar or something, and they don't know what to do with it, and they should be calling you.
Exactly. And yeah, since we have been discussing a lot about like the challenges when it comes to the law and policy perspective, I would like to ask Christine specifically on like what are the challenges that you have observed in your career while using the satellite data for your application for Streamology, the company. And I think I have also heard that drones were also used as complementary. So why was this happening? So more about it, yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the interesting challenge you have is the change in technology over time and the increasing level of accuracy. So you go back to the early Landsat imagery. While it's great, if you zoom in, it's not so great. You can't get a lot of detail. But then as we're moving through time into what we get from the Sentinel satellites now is amazing level of accuracy. So just knowing when you get data, what can you expect in terms of accuracy? What sort of coverage does it cover? That sort of metadata behind it. And so that then sets what are the bounds of how you can actually use it. What are you going to be able to get out of it realistically and have confidence in? So that's really important to know about the data as well. Benchmarking of data, so knowing have they actually checked it, how often does it get calibrated, all that type of thing, because if you're using it to do a model, your model is only as accurate as the data you feed it. So we've got to know a bit about that sort of information as well. And sometimes you get data sets and that doesn't follow, you don't track or there isn't included with the data as information on all of that. So you're not 100% sure how that's sort of come through in time. The reason we use drones and bring drones into it is they're sort of the interface between satellite imagery and someone on the ground. And we had a good example looking at this environmental water and the effect on wetlands in the River Murray system in Australia. So there's a lot of wetlands that have been starved of water over a long period of time, and they're trying to reconnect them and get the plants to grow and the animals to come back. And with that, you can look at the remote sense data, but it doesn't give you enough detail. And so then you've got the biologist or the ecologists on the ground who do a little 1 by 1 meter square and count how many plants are in that square of the different types. And there's this mismatch between what you can get from a satellite and what the ecologist is seeing on the ground. And so drones sit in that in-between space. So trying to bring down the information that you've got from the satellites to interpret what the ecologists are seeing on the ground. And try to sort of, can we take the really, really detailed data, push it out a little bit to give us a bit more information, and then bring down the satellite information to help us as well to broaden out that understanding across a wider area. So it's just knowing where to use the different tools and what they can tell us to help to inform our overall decisions.
Yeah, I think that the way you have mentioned how the drones come into this whole scenario and the various other challenges, I think that was a very, what do you call it, like concise idea of the challenges that you have faced when it comes to using satellite data for your application. And adding to that, another question that I would like to ask is like, when you apply all this data, like when you use these services, like how different is it like when it comes to urban and rural areas? Like when it comes to the application part, like how different can it be? Like when it comes to urban area, is it easier than the rural part, or is it the vice versa? How do you?
I suppose the problem, well, from our perspective, is rural generally has no data if it's not satellite derived, because there's just no coverage of other types of data sources. So it's sort of the go-to if you have a rural area is, well, let's look at the satellites. What can they tell us? Urban areas are probably more data rich, so there's lots of other sources of data. People track them. They take aerial imagery a lot more regularly over those sort of locations, and so there's actually a lot more information you can find. But for rural areas, it's a critical data source because you don't have locally derived data often.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. I mean, it's very interesting to see how different kinds of data are being complementing to each other, and that actually maximizes the scope of the application as well. It's really interesting to listen to. And moving on to actually the law and policy side of things, Donna, what are the commercial challenges in actually, you said that you were working with companies to make agreements and things like that. So what do you see as commercial challenges in these kinds of avenues?
Yeah, well, we've already mentioned the issue of charging for too large an area, and I think that is being addressed by some companies slowly, and it's up to the users to kind of drive that a bit. But I think, as I mentioned, one of the big challenges there is the private data providing companies just need to update themselves in their approach to customers. And it's funny because if you look at, the whole idea of new space, as opposed to the traditional companies, is they're meant to be customer centric and customer focused and so on. And even the big companies, they always have some sort of mantra that says they're customer focused. But when it comes down to the brass tacks of what's in their agreements, they're often not. They're often shocked when you ask for changes. They're often very poorly drafted documents that don't actually even make sense. They've been cobbled together from lots of different areas. If you can imagine, if it was software, it'd be like taking, something from Windows and something from Linux and stapling it all together and hoping it works. That's the equivalent. It just doesn't really work sometimes. And some of these documents have been drafted probably 20 years ago, and they haven't, maybe they might be reusing things that they found from, companies that are long gone, and they're just, somebody's got them on a hard drive and they're still using them. That's my impression. And so when you actually read them, which I think no one does, you read them and you go, oh, that doesn't really make sense. Could we just write it so that it does make sense? They're all outraged and annoyed, and unless you're really huge and you've got a lot of bargaining power, they don't really want to talk to you and they get all offended. So that's the biggest challenge, is just getting people to think about, what does my customer need? What protections do I need as a company, as a data provider, and what is the best way to write that? Because there is a massive mismatch, not only between people like Christine, who are wanting to maybe purchase data, and if it was easy and affordable, you would do it more often, but also with governments. So this is where you've got oil and water. You've got governments. When governments buy data, they usually are required to do it with a tender process. They usually have massive procurement policies and everything. And they have, a procurement contract this thick that the individual people negotiating the contract are not permitted to change the key terms, blah, blah, blah. This is how these big bureaucracies work. Now you've got the same thing. You've got a big satellite company, and then you've got a big government, and the terms, they don't match at all. So you might have some people in a department in India or a department in Australia or anywhere saying, we really could use some data. We would be able to understand our agriculture industry better if we had access to data, and our people would really benefit from that if we could get some of this fine-tuned data that's only available if you pay commercially. We're prepared to pay, but we just want to do it. But trying to actually match the oil and the water together, we need a multiplier, don't we? So we need to be able to somehow bridge. It's a massive chasm. It's a chasm. And so, that's my nerdy problem that I'm often dealing with day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally resonate with what you just mentioned about, even though there are certain challenges which can be rectified immediately, and then when it comes to the long term, there are other challenges as well. Anyway, as we are concluding and reaching to the final few minutes of this podcast, today we had a very insightful session with Christine and Donna here, and we talked about a lot of things, starting from data, how data is being used, and like what are the policy challenges, law and policy challenges when it comes to data usage and things like that. And I'm really glad that both of our experts, they mentioned about how multidisciplinary aspect is really important when it comes to addressing issues relating to climate change and environmental assessment and things like that. And it was such an insightful session today. And thank you so much, Christine and Donna, for joining us. And we are indeed grateful to both of you to be a part of this Cosmic Sandbox Space Smurfs collaboration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so this is your host, Alina Joseph, signing out, and we will see you guys with another episode this month. Until then, be safe, keep smurfing, and bye-bye.